Before we start, I want to explain a few things. This has just been a lingering thought in my head, and I was hoping I wouldn't really need to be the one to make this video. But as I've scrolled through the different videos online, it's just reinforced my need to make this video. If you feel that I missed something, it's probably because I did. I want to make it abundantly clear that this is not the only way this can be interpreted. It can be interpreted in any number of ways. This is just the way that strikes me the most.
Until all the chapters are out, and even when all the chapters are out, a lot of things will still be left for speculation.
This video is all about moral gray areas, redemption, and deals with a lot of narrative traps, maybe even meta narrative traps. I apologize for how rough this may actually sound. This is my first time making a video after all, so please forgive me if this comes off as a little rough. Whew, alright, here we go. Let's start off with narrative traps. Maybe even narrative subversion. What is narrative subversion? Narrative subversion refers to the strategic use of storytelling to challenge and undermine the established norms that a story has set up previously. There are many good examples of this in video games, literature, and media of all kinds. Undertale being the prime example for Deltarune's case. In Undertale, we first name the fallen human, and we are immediately thrown into a body of Frisk, and control them as if we would control anything else, under the assumption that that is who we were the entire game, until the rug is pulled out from under us and it's revealed that we were Frisk all along. You may be asking why Undertale is relative to Deltarune in this context, and that is because of the player themselves. This is where it gets very interesting, because the player knows what happened in Undertale. Now, let's take a step back and look at Toby's perspective on this. If you were making a narrative and you needed a certain thing to happen, you expected your players to act a certain way, what would you do? Let's face it, there are very few people who are ever going to play Deltarune before they play Undertale. So the meta-narrative trap has already been set. The moral story that Undertale told is likely not the same that Deltarune will tell. And I have a good argument for such a moral gray route, as it were. A very weird route. And really, it's more weird than you may think. And with that, let's talk about the other theories that this theory assumes, and then we can get to the core of the theory itself. Now, on to the side theories. These theories aren't necessary to the main point per se, but they help smooth things over, as it were. Des is likely the knight. This theory assumes that the player is the angel. The prophecy likely can't be changed, but it can be bent for sure, leading to the only one ending, etc. Noelle is being made into the vessel in the weird route. Chris has not had a soul for a while since the divorce, or when Azrael left, or when Des vanished, etc. The player is the main character of the story, not Chris. Chris uses the player like a tool to get what they want, and we as the player control Chris, making a very interesting dynamic between the player and Chris. I won't be going over these too incredibly much. There's already a lot of different videos out there that talk about these subjects, but I wanted to put them out there anyway because the theory does kind of rely on some of it. And finally, we're here. The points of the main theory itself. Don't pull out your pitchforks. I know that some of these things I'm going to be pointing out are probably a little outrageous, but just stick with me and keep an open mind.
I think that there are likely three different endings. Now, endings that are bent, not completely different endings. There might be a completely different ending, but I do believe that ending would be a path to hell, as it were. The other two endings is likely a tragic meta-hero like death, and lastly would be the foolish hero's path. The pacifist route in Deltarune is not equivalent to the pacifist route in Undertale. It is very likely, in fact, it is extremely likely, that the pacifist route in Deltarune is a meta-narrative trap that will possibly lead to save bleed, among other things. It may, in fact, also lead to Chapter 0. More than that, though, the weird route is not the same as the No Mercy route from Undertale, and is, in fact, also likely a meta-narrative trap. The three saves that we are given is also very likely to be a meta-narrative trap, or more of a meta-narrative snare, just to trap the player that says, I just want to see what happens, with the false safety of just loading another save. And finally, I come to my main point. The weird route is likely the only way to get a good ending where, quote-unquote, everyone is happy. Now, I think this really hits on the angel's desire. At the end of the day, most players are going to want everyone in the story to be happy. And with that, the question of, even with future knowledge, even with the best of intentions, can the player be forgiven? What does a time traveler look like to a non-time traveler? It would be really weird, right? Just incredibly strange, the actions that someone might take. It would be a really weird route, right? Alright, now let's start breaking down these points. Alright, so first, the pacifist route. Everyone is likely going to be running the pacifist route on their first playthrough. Now, ask yourself, is Toby really just going to make us run Undertale 2.0, or is Deltarune going to be its own thing? We have moments in the story where Ralsei and Susie both meet in the middle, a gray area. Susie learns that violence isn't always the answer, and Ralsei learns that maybe being nice to everyone isn't always the answer to everything. And in the end, in Chapter 4, even says to the player that they tried to change the prophecy by being really nice, but clearly it wasn't good enough. Now, in the weird route, Ralsei says that the ending may in fact be worse, but I think that comes from a lack of knowledge more than knowledge itself. I feel that this casts a lot of doubt on the pacifist route, and really sets up an incredible narrative trap for the average player to walk into. Again, what happens? People play Undertale, they assume that being pacifist is the good guy, so they're just going to run pure pacifist. And the only thing that would really change that is the saves. And that is also a very interesting point. There are 3 save files. Why are there 3 save files? And the reason that there are 3 save files is to absolutely catch the average player going, ooh, I wonder what happens when I do this. I'm just going to make a new save, and then I'm going to see what happens. And I believe that this is another route in which we can see save bleed happen. Save bleed is going to be a critical thing that happens in a lot of the endings. I think only the true ending won't really have save bleed in it, much like we saw in Undertale. Now, what does that mean? Will that mean that at the end of a pacifist route that you'll just get a neutral ending, or will this perhaps lead to a Chapter 0? This is starting to get into a questionable zone.
I truly believe that it will lead to a save bleed scenario that will lead the player to Chapter 0 and possibly set up a sword route scenario, much like we saw in the Chapter 3 game. I think that it will possibly go that way, and the sword route will be much more prophetic than anything else. In fact, because of that possibility, this may in fact be where the 3 saves really start to come into play. If there is save bleed, then the 3 saves presented would be much more dangerous in this case, where you're starting off at Chapter 0, possibly looking into a sword route where there could in fact be save bleed happening. Again, 90% of players are more than likely going to be running the pacifist route, and that is what makes this so intriguing. There has to be, even if you don't believe in the save bleed, even if you don't believe in everything else I've said about this pacifist route theory, the pacifist route cannot be the good end route. It is just not narratively sound. Again, this is not Undertale. There is no question in my mind that the pacifist route is a narrative trap that Toby has set up. I'm willing to bet that 90% of the people who are watching this video are shaking their head in disbelief. That there is no world where Toby would do this, but I would beg to differ. Again, you just need to look at it from Toby's perspective. Some of the best tales ever told were morally gray ones, and I think we're going to find that this is a great morally gray story. And I think anyone continuing down the pacifist route is going to find themselves at the foolish hero's end. Chris will have likely used the player to get what they wanted out of the player, and the player will likely be, quote-unquote, used up, possibly leading up to the prophecy's fulfillment, leading to the banishment of the angel's heaven, or the angel, or however you would like to bend that prophecy. Or it could also possibly lead to a Chapter 0 scenario with the player feeling so annoyed that they are able to go back to Chapter 0 and possibly lead to the sword route. Again, speculation. It's also highly likely that the neutral route will lead to this as well. There's even a third possibility that all routes will lead to this Chapter 0 revelation. Alright, let's go ahead and get into the sword route, or as I like to call it, the twisted sword route. The reason why I've looked so hard at the sword route minigame in Chapter 3 is because it tells a prophecy of sorts. At least that's how I interpret it. It is highly likely that we will not be able to activate any kind of sword route that we know of currently. Even with Chapter 5 releasing, I highly doubt all of a sudden we will be able to enter any kind of sword route. We will likely see this after a pacifist or a neutral run. I want to leave a little bit of wiggle room here and say that the weird route could also end up here too, depending. Like, if you were running a violent weird route run, yeah, it probably would be a more neutral styled run. I don't believe that you would just get the quote-unquote bad ending for doing that. I think that it would load you into Chapter 0, very likely. Now, this is where I'm going to make a distinction from the Snowgrave route and the weird route. In the Chapter 3 sword route, we see the Snowgrave route inside of the sword route. The twisted sword route, as it were. The reason why we see that is because it's clearly needed for that route. Now, that doesn't mean that the Snowgrave route or the weird route is locked into that sword route, and that's the only place that that route can possibly be. It means it's more of a crossroads of sorts. 2 different routes crossing at that section. One the Snowgrave route, one the weird route. Now, the argument to be made here at the end of the sword route
the twisted sword route, mind you, is that Chris or the player is used up. It is kind of hinted that it might be Chris, but there's still the possibility that it's the player. But I think it's more likely that the player is used up in the neutral route. There's a reason why Chris never discards that thorn ring, huh? And again, at the end of the bad ending or the worst ending where we've likely won the game, the save bleed from that would likely be devastating, much like the No Mercy route in Undertale. Alright, we're finally here. The weird route. What makes the weird route weird? Like, really weird? Well, let's look at it from the time traveler's perspective and the non-time traveler's perspective. Now, a time traveler will know exactly what needs to be done, in what exact order it needs to be done to make a certain event happen because they've been through time. Now, from a non-time traveler's perspective, they would see a bunch of esoteric bull happening constantly around them, and it would start to question everything, and it would just seem really weird. Now, the reason why I call it the weird route and not the Snowgrave route is because I believe that the Snowgrave route is specifically only for the sword route, and that the weird route is 100% only for the weird route. I know I keep forgetting to call the sword route the twisted sword route, but I'm going to be honest, I think it is probably just going to be called the sword route at the end of the day, when Chapter 0 is revealed and everything is clear. But make no mistake, the twisted sword will be playing a very crucial role in that, and I do not believe that Noelle will be using the twisted sword. I think that that will be a Chris item that happens during the neutral / pacifist route, possibly. I think that most people will see why the weird route needs to be run in a very weird way after the pacifist route is completed. They will be presented with a Chapter 0, and there's a good possibility that it will either result in save bleed or will result in a better opportunity to get a better quote-unquote ending, with the weird route having a more impactful route if somehow the weird route doesn't immediately lead to a better ending. Again, better ending in quotation marks. And no, I'm not saying that Toby would have some kind of edgy, it's cool that you froze all these people or anything like that. What I'm rather saying is that the story has enough open-endedness to possibly fix that. There's been a lot of joke posts that we're going to be making a dark fountain in Rudy's hospital room, and possibly doing the same for Birdley. Birdley being the more difficult narrative choice here, because thawing them out might be something that just happens in Chapter 5. I don't know. We did turn on the space heater. You had the option to turn on the space heater to a higher setting. On to Queen. Queen is the laptop on which we froze all of that data. The data is just something that can be opened and closed and not necessarily deleted. We froze it. It's like freezing a program on a task manager. You just close it and reopen the program and boom, it's back. At no point did we actually kill anything or anyone. Even the plugs, actually, that were there were frozen, but those are just power plugs. They're not inanimate objects. It wasn't like they broke in the real world either. It was just frozen, so they might get cold. That doesn't mean anything. It wouldn't be equivalent of taking a playing card and ripping it in half in real life and then bringing it to the dark world to just, seeing them ripped in half, literally. There's also the point of Chapter 3's mantle game, or the sword route. There, we pick up a sword and we start killing all the data within that. Now, that poses the question, is that considered killing in the game? Or will simply resetting the game bring them all back like nothing happened? And they, can't talk in the game, so does that count? Or where are we drawing the line? But regardless of that, The manipulation of Noel is by far the most disturbing thing that happens in the Weird Route. And that is where the real moral conundrum begins. So, let's ask the question. Can the player realistically be forgiven? Can the player seek redemption from this act? And I think that the answer to that question is highly subjective based upon whether or not that player was just seeing what was going to happen. And this is also where Save Bleed really throws a wrench, I think, in everything. Again, those 3 save files are not there for your convenience. Those 3 save files are there to test you. The entire journey has been a big moral test of character. Someone who looks down at the characters and views them as less than what they are, like just a game or anything else, will obviously be viewed as more demonic than someone who's always tried to treat them nice no matter what. And honestly, the amount of time between chapters only intensifies this reaction, which is extremely interesting and makes me ask whether or not it was intentional that the chapters were drawn out like this. I don't think so, but it's still interesting to ask. So, again, let's change the perspective away from the player and towards the characters. They see the character making all these weird choices. Why in the world would they freeze everyone, manipulate Noel, and spare everyone, and be a good person all the time? Were they agreeable? Were they nasty and mean? Did they just want to see what happened if they just were, completely mean in one save file and nice in another? At the end of the day, the prophecy can't be undone. So, does it really matter? And I think that yes, it does. From a story perspective, from a narrative perspective, the player is banished, but everyone views the player a little bit differently depending on what they've done. And at the end, when you're judged for what you've done, I don't know if it's going to be Sans, I highly doubt that, but I think there will be something of a judgment scene. And it's highly likely that even with the best of intentions, that the player would need to be banished, as it were. Maybe not the angel's heaven in that way, but the angel themselves, as it were. So it is very likely that even with the best of intentions, that you would possibly be looked at as if you were a demon of some kind, and possibly banished from the world, and all of the friends you made along the way only viewing you as a demon, possibly. And that is somewhat of a tragedy in and of itself. But the question at that point is that an acceptable end? And I think that I've seen enough media, I've read enough literature, I've played enough games that have had these kinds of endings, and I must say that some of the tragic tales usually tend to be some of the best tales. They might not be as warm and fuzzy as it would like, but again, what are you willing to give up to have a happy ending for what you sought? What was the player seeking? What is 90% of the player base seeking? A happy ending. The angel banished will finally meet with its desire. Again, I'm not saying this is absolute and this is all canon and it has to be this way or, anything like that. I think that I'm probably 90% right, but I could also be 90% wrong. I'm not really sure how to end this video. So let's do a montage of bad takes of terrible theories. The king's truck cannot be stopped. I am Mike. Mike is the knight. The knight weeps as it turns to look at you because it realizes that if it doesn't battle you, it'll create a time paradox. Alright, bye.